this is another episode of Narrative Wake. I'm the usual host, Thorin. Got my co-host, well, which one is it again? Oh, wait a minute, why is Monty in the left box now? Everyone knows I put the co-host in the right box. No, obviously co-host Kelsey Moser, because it's Narrative Wake, not that other show, which, we don't say that name around here. Actually, I say it almost every fucking episode, but that's just my own narcissism. Now, our guest for this episode is MonteCristo. And first of all, I'll just go ahead and immediately say, even though it's not my fault, I immediately apologize, Monty, for the fact that you naively think you're just coming on to have a chat about some cool aspects of history of League of Legends that you're involved in. But just by doing this episode, you have, in some sadly perverse sense, basically corroborated the utterly inane conspiracy theory that you will come crawling back to League of Legends one day, or that you secretly miss it and that you really want to come back, But obviously that's nothing to do with it, is it,
No, I just enjoy the history of the game of League of Legends, which I was an active part of. And contrary to popular belief, because I'm told that I have no valid opinions on League of Legends anymore because I left the game, even though I lived 5 years of my life, covering various aspects, pretty much all aspects of League of Legends, if I'm going to be honest. I haven't actually been mind wiped by the men in black at Riot. They didn't send them over and wave their fancy flash stick at me, so I forgot everything that happened. But some people seem to believe that's true.
Sure. I mean, obviously, for everyone who's, there's always a lot of new fans coming in the scene. Obviously, MonteCristo works in OverWatch, which is that game where, this is a very easy way to remember the two games, okay? So Overwatch is that game where when it was the number one played game in the PC bangs in Korea, you guys all said that doesn't matter, that number doesn't mean anything, it has no relation to esports. But the second it wasn't the number one game in the PC bangs in Korea, that number became the most important metric in the world. It proved that League of Legends is still on top. It's the biggest esports game, and that Overwatch has entirely failed. And with your incredible insight, which involves zero inside information, and in fact on a topic where no expert can actually know, you are all convinced and know that it's going to die, it's a bad game. And even more so than that, you're totally not bothered by it, you're not threatened by it, in no way do you even care about it, as you repeatedly tell me, hounding me and obsessively posting that on everything, again, not to do with League of Legends.
Not to mention that you all probably have opinions about the sale price of the teams because you're all expert businessmen, certainly smarter than billionaires and venture capitalist firms who have done market research. And you know definitively that there is no possible business model that could result in recouping this and making a profit.
Welcome back to the League of Legends.
But yet are simultaneously convinced that it is possible to recoup that money from a League of Legends team, even though there is no current in-game monetization that is available for teams. Yeah. And no plans to create localized revenue either through ticket sales.
Well, what I loved about that, right, was that really does tie in perfectly to Reddit's analysis of the Immortals situation in League of Legends, where what they said was, actually, no, guys, don't worry, it wasn't corruption, because what happened was Riot just assessed all the business plans, and they found that the Immortals one wasn't sustainable and wouldn't have definitely worked in the long term. And I obviously just wanted to just go... None of them are sustainable in the long run. Everyone is gambling. It doesn't actually make... it's not like 9 of them were like, well, this is airtight. And the Immortals one was like, oh, that's a bit risky, isn't it? You're investing a lot of money you might not get back one day. We can't allow you to do that. What's that Golden State Warriors guy? You can have 2 more teams and that's it. Okay, I've told you already. Owning teams Then again, Monty, I don't want to tread into dangerous ground there by talking about how, any sort of ownership stake, future or current, technically means that the person now owns it and must be punished for it by being told they have a whole year to keep breaking that rule. Anyway, right, we've been to a bit here. What we've done here is replace my usual indulgent intro with an indulgent 3-person roast of the very community we now hope to watch this episode. But you know what? They don't have a choice. It's not like anyone else is making content like this. So today's topic is going to be a classic. It's one of the big topics, I think, in the history of League of Legends, because it's about what I actually still to this day consider one of the most mysterious teams. It's about the Samsung White team that won the World Championship in Season 4. And what makes this team so mysterious is they did play for basically a whole year, a whole season of League of Legends with this lineup, the one where obviously they traded out Dade to the Samsung Blue team and they brought in Pawn from what was the Blue team. And they didn't win LCK, Never even made an LCK final with this exact lineup, actually. But because they won Worlds and they won it in the, perhaps the most dominant fashion. Because the reason why I would say perhaps the most dominant fashion is, even the games they lost was like semi-trolling, whereas like, when SK Telecom lose the game, it's a real
Which
game
we'll get into in this episode, because people who didn't watch Korea probably don't know that team had a tendency to troll when they thought they were far better than their opponents.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll also talk about that, because it's like, how long is it trolling before it just becomes a symptom of their play in general, right? So
don't reveal your hand too early, Kelsey.
So.
Kelsey, you're supposed to save some of these. It's not a surprise now.
I have a few,
So anyway, the reason why that makes them mysterious to me is they basically were only in the form that everyone who wants to call them the best team ever for one tournament. Now, yes, at that one tournament, you could maybe make the case that they were the best or the most dominant, but that's why I think it's a really interesting debate, because to me, there's obviously no solvable perfect solution to are they the best team or aren't they? It's going to come down to what people's criteria is and how they interpret the times they didn't win and then the times they did win. So let's start here. Right, Monty, at the top of this episode, unless I'm mistaken, you are one of the people who put them down as the best team ever, right?
I may have at one point in time. I think I'd have to revisit that in my brain. And I also don't know if I have the most valid opinion anymore, because I didn't really watch much League of Legends within the past year. So it's hard for me to compare them to current teams. It doesn't seem like the current teams were as dominant as Samsung White was. I think by the end, this is a very complex conversation, because it requires a lot of sort of inside knowledge of what was going on at the time and how the simultaneous development of Samsung Blue and White and how these teams affected each other over the course of 2014. I would have a tendency to say that this probably was at its peak, as brief as it was, perhaps the best team ever. But it's also a factor of that 2014 Korea Champions was probably the best League of Legends that we're ever going to see comparatively, because it was pre-Chinese exodus. We had all these superstar players at their peaks. There was an incredible variety of competitive teams that were playing in Korea during the year of 2014. And it was just like, it was an insanely exciting system, because we hadn't moved to the league format. We were still in the tournament format as well. And there was also Masters. So this was the year that,
yes.
Let's set this up for people who didn't know. So Champions used to be a tournament format that was held 3 times per year. Now, OGN's goal for the creation of League of Legends in Korea at this time was to mirror what had happened in StarCraft Brood War. So what happened in StarCraft Brood War was you had, on OGN, you had the OSL, which was the Star League, which was a 3 times per year tournament. And then you had something called Pro League, which was a team league that ran for an extended period of time over the course of the year. Now, it's obviously weird to do a team league in a team game like League of Legends, but they got around this by inviting all the teams that had sister teams, which was like all the Kespa teams at the time, and putting them in a longer league called Masters, which Samsung also won. So there was so much League of Legends that it was all super exciting, because you had these peaks in terms of these tournaments, and then you had this consistent like slow build of popularity that was Masters at the time, where the format was each team played a best of 3. You had to play one of your roster. So like Samsung White had to play and Samsung Blue had to play in the first 2 games. And then in the third game, you could mix all your players together. So you could make a mixed roster, or you could field the entirety of Samsung White or Blue again. So the teams had a decision to make in game 3 as to which roster that they wanted to field. And so this was like a really cool format that we only saw ever happen once, because after 2014, everything got fucked and we had to move to the league system as Riot made everything around the world uniform. So for me, 2014, when I think back about my career in Korea casting league from 2012 to the end of 2016, I really think about 2014 as my favorite year of casting LoL.
Okay, so let's start there then, because I mean we are going to definitely unravel a lot of these threads and at some point go back to the beginning, but I think you have to start at the top there on this big topic. So Kelsey, Monty's made a pretty decent baseline argument there, which sets up the premise that they could be the best team, which is to say if the competition they played against was the best and the league that format was the best and it was the most competitive year, if you then come out of that and win, in theory, the biggest tournament, that's certainly an argument. What would you say to that?
I think, yeah. So when going back a little bit to the argument that they trolled or they changed up how they played, I don't think it was just trolling as much as altering like what they could get away with in mid lane to an extent, or altering what they could get away with in different positions. And I think we saw a lot more of Samsung White breaking the mold that they played against teams that were really top teams at Worlds than they did in Champions, right? So to an extent, or in the Champions playoffs, and by that I mean having pawn on like a wave clear mid so that they could always have mid priority. So to that extent, I think that if you want to talk about like the best championship or the championship with the most prestige, you would give it to people who won champions. But based and considering how much Samsung White was taking certain teams seriously at Worlds, however, obviously there were issues with Samsung Blue, and I think it's more beneficial to look at the changes that Samsung White made between Champion Summer and Worlds in terms of assessing like if these were major gameplay-based changes that allowed them to become the best team, or if they didn't change. And I do think that they did change, but throughout the year, it was kind of like Samsung Blue to an extent leading them along, in part because of the frequency of patch changes. So looking at the totality of the year, I would say Samsung Blue is the better team of 2014. And if you're setting it up like Champions, and 2014 was the greatest ever. Yeah, I agree that Champions in 2014 was probably the pinnacle in my mind of Korean League of Legends in general. Just because I do think
League of Legends.
Yeah, of course. So far, obviously. I think that the pinnacle of Korean League of Legends so far, and part of that to me, just reviewing the VODs for this episode, was looking at what you said before, which was how the sister team system affected teams so much. And the way that the Masters event showcased the idea that each 2-team pair was a team. And I think that really benefited the sense that the Korean teams at the time were extremely dominant. Of course, you can then look at Matcha White Shield and talk about like whether or not that was accurate overall, but Samsung at least was an organization that managed to place itself above almost everyone. So,
okay. So essentially, like to boil that down, we have to consider them in the context of Samsung Blue as well.
Yes. So here's the thing. Like as a general principle, my reaction to Kelsey's point about Samsung Blue being the better team over the course of the year is to agree with her. But there are two different factors at play here. So the way that I remember these teams is that Samsung Blue, as Kelsey noted, was faster to adapt to patch changes during the course of the regular season. So they were the ones who are more consistently innovating on new champion picks. But Samsung White, what they were doing that was different is not so much about the champion picks, but they were innovating vision control with Dandy and Mata, and they completely changed the way that support and jungles worked together to acquire vision during that period, which also ties back to Kelsey's point about Pawn using wave clear mids to have mid priority, because it's opened up deep invades into the jungle in a lot of ways. So this was by the time that we had seen the Dade Pawn swap, Dade was the more innovative mid laner in terms of bringing out the Yasuo play, and it was always champions that Dade played followed by Pawn picking them up and learning. So you could see how the individual players were learning champion picks from each other, and the power picks, because we didn't have as many patches at Worlds, it was that White, I think, had a higher ceiling but was slower to adapt. And that's why we saw this huge peak of Samsung White at the actual World Championship.
Well, I mean, couldn't you put it this way, Monty? Like, I think if you look at them, ignoring just the cultural context at the time of, like, yes, Blue was considered an excellent team and they were in the finals twice, I think you could make a pretty solid case that White were the better players and Blue was the better team at the time. And therefore, the team got ahead of things, adapted, played around things better. But then, as Kelsey alluded to, because there wasn't really massive patch changes from the end of Champions to Worlds, this lengthened period where you're not having to now adapt, you're just playing what exists, and now what you've learned from the other team means that well, in theory, better players if they can learn from a team that is ahead of them in terms of adaptation. You'll always actually, I think, dominate if you can refine what someone else figured out. Whereas sometimes figuring something out, it's great for a surprise or to get ahead early, but eventually, probably the strength of the players and the team's going to have to decide whether you win these games or not.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to talk about because if we think about these teams and think about their strengths, you'd say, okay, both of these teams had great AD carries in Imp and Deft. But for the most part, otherwise their strengths were sort of inverse to each other, because we had Dade and Acorn, who were like much stronger solo lanes on blue, but you had much weaker supports and jungles in terms of Spirit and Heart, right? But on the other side, you have Samsung White, who had much more, I would say, like either a wave clear mid laner in the form of Pawn, or a very teleport focused top laner who's helping out the bottom lane in a player like Looper. But you have such amazing strength from the support position in Dandy and Mata.
I have a lot to kind of add on to this, but I'll just right now restrict the point to talking about what you just brought up, which was the mids and the supports. I think something that's really interesting to talk about in terms of the mid lane swap is that ultimately I think Pawn did give them more versatility, because Dade was kind of was probably essential in being slow to adapt to different champions. So everyone around him kind of adapted and they picked up the pace from there. The other aspect was I felt like Dade, like Samsung themselves have retroactively said that part of the fundamental reason was that Dade worked better with Spirit. And I think if you look at the way Mata worked with Dandy, there wasn't really anyone on blue that filled that same role. And so Dade kind of ended up filling that role for the jungle.
Kelsey,
so I think that's a good way to look at it.
One of the problems that people often always said when it was the MVP White or Ozone, when it was the previous year, when obviously Dade was with Dandy and Mata, is that it's too many cooks. You've got three people who in theory want to have control over the game, shot call elements of it. So just naturally it would make more sense to divide them up, especially because, as you're saying, Samsung Blue didn't really have anyone like that, right?
Yeah, I agree. I also think that the thing that I would say that Samsung White really brought to the table, and this is part of the reason why I think this topic's really interesting, is not necessarily to talk about like whether or not Samsung White were the best team, but what Samsung White did well, because I feel like over the year, people have just elevated Samsung White into this team that ticked every single box and was good at every single thing. So just like characterizing Samsung White. So for me, what Samsung White really brought to the table is they made jungle a team game, as opposed to a single person doing the role based on whether or not his lanes were doing this and putting like all of that work on his shoulders. Whereas Samsung White were much more about making that a team game. And to an extent, Blue tried to do that, but there was just no one who was really good at the laning elements of the game to kind of bring that to the forefront as much, I think.
Well, put it this way, I've always said this, right? There is no actual team in the history of League of Legends who ever sat down and thought, right, our whole plan is to scale and to get to the late game, and that's where we crush them. Because you know what? We're just like a finesse team, right? That just means you can't win in the early game. And basically that just becomes your eventual goal because you played and that developed naturally. So, I mean, basically...
Which was Samsung Blue's identity, by the way.
Samsung Blue couldn't have done the early game shit that Samsung White did, right? No. So they had to develop in a different way.
And also, people forget that we've talked about this before, but Samsung White was definitely an early game team. And as Kelsey said, they snowballed off the strength of playing the jungle, which I do have a very interesting personal anecdote about in a minute. But that style often led to them. And if you go back and you actually watch the semifinals that White lost, frequently they would crush the early game and then have no fucking clue what to do in the mid and late game. And one of the reasons they did so well at the World Championship was they never really had to play a mid or like a late game at Worlds. They were so dominant early that we never even saw how good they were late game.
Right. And there were a few moments where you saw them even lose like late game team fights for no apparent reason at Worlds after getting a lead, but they would still be so far ahead that it was kind of like you did super well on the first part of the test that you can just kind of like fuck off and fall asleep during the second half and still get an A, right? So I think that's sort of what happens to Samsung White in that regard. One thing that I think is a bit overlooked in terms of their transformation between Champions and Worlds was how they changed their approach to using the minions in side lanes, because I think generally at the time, people were looking at Samsung Blue as like the better minion control team. But I think that what Samsung White ended up doing ended up being better than Samsung Blue's approach, and ended up being something that people can look to even now, that people are screwing up even now. And that's, to me, like one of Samsung White's really, really overlooked contributions, is just the fact that they would, I guess, fast push side lanes so that teams couldn't necessarily have like the stacked waves that they could get and clear out their turret to come back, because they weren't as precise about that during Champions. And I think that that was something that Samsung Blue abused, because Samsung Blue did a lot of the slow pushes, and it didn't necessarily matter because people didn't have a good way to answer that. But Samsung White were just very good at using just like streamlining a single wave to the turret so that the enemy team would lose all of the minions in between their turret and then the other side. So I think that that was something that ended up making them into a team that was capable of beating Samsung White or beating everyone else, and no one could really come back against, and it just transferred their mid-game control into a victory. So.
Okay. Where does that go then?
No, I guess it's a good point. Like, as in terms of differentiating their play prior to Worlds with their play at Worlds. The personal anecdote that has to do with the jungle situation that I wanted to talk about was, I'm sure many people remember the ill-fated CLG boot camp in Korea, which happened obviously directly before the NALCS playoffs. So we're talking about something that was happening in the lead up to Worlds. And this was when I first started getting very impressed by Samsung White, and why when it came to the World Championship that I started to predict them that they would actually win the whole thing, when the more logical conclusion would be after the last two seasons of Champions, where they lost both times in the semifinals to Samsung Blue, that Samsung Blue would have been the stronger team. But one thing that I noticed that they started to really heavily innovate immediately prior to Worlds was the concept of vertical jungling. So that would be deep pressure, putting wards in and allowing the jungler to clear out either both sides of the top side of the map above the mid lane, or both sides of the bottom below the mid lane. And there are so many times where they were very precise. Now, it sounds obvious today because we see it all the time, but at that time, it was very confusing to play against when CLG was scrimming them, or later when I was coaching SK immediately prior to Worlds, because they had such an advanced grasp on where Mata and Dandy could go and where they would be safe. And they would also kill your jungler constantly, even on your side of the map, because you didn't have any pressure. So there was no way for you to collapse back without taking heavy losses or losing a turret or a bunch of minions. So this was something that many teams had not really experienced prior to seeing, and even scrimming against Samsung Blue, they were not anywhere near as good at this as Samsung White was. But it was about translating early game pressure based off of heavy wave clear mids and AD carries. They were playing primarily on the bottom side of the map because they were using Looper's teleport to join in some of these engagements. And this was infuriating to play against at the time, because you couldn't do standard jungling against them, and they were just 2 steps ahead of you at jungle pathing already. So they would basically just kill and or starve out your jungler and then snowball super heavily into the mid game.
Well, I mean, to put this in context, again, for people who weren't watching back then, you also have to remember Season 3 was back when you used to just be able to buy wards and place them. Like, at that point in time, you controlled vision by just being in the lead and putting more and more and more wards down, and then clearing the other guys' wards, and then you just strangle them out. Whereas in Season 4, we already had the trinkets, I believe, by this point in time, so you had limited wards. So if you remember, like you said before, Kelsey, it was very much more an individual game for the jungler. Like, the jungler it's up to him where he's going to put the wards and what he's going to do. So traditionally, if the jungler's putting his wards, he's doing that because he's setting up a gank or a path. The support's putting wards to protect his AD carry. They're kind of working separately. Whereas in this era, you have limited wards. They found a way to maximize what both of the people who are using the wards most of the time can do with it by splitting the map, picking one half. And then this is actually the genius part that no one thought of, is that when you have entire vision on the bottom half of the map, for example, you now also can predict where the other guy is when he's not on the bottom half of the map by process of elimination. You know if he must be in the top half of the map because he's not in a lane. So you actually also know where the jungler is when he's not in the part that you have the vision control on. And I remember, I think I did an interview, I think it was with Nuke Doc at the end of Season 5, and he basically said, even though Samsung White obviously never played a game after Season 4 Worlds, the entire next year, every other team in the world just copied this. Like, that was just how every team was like, right, that's how vision works now.
Look, I can only describe it at the time. Like I said, it seems very obvious now if you're like a hardcore League fan or an analyst or somebody who follows the game closely. But I can't stress enough, like at the time, we were all trying to figure out how the fuck they were doing this and like what exactly the step-by-step process was that wasn't going to get your jungler starved or killed, because they had mastered this, they were so far ahead of everybody else in terms of this that it was just ridiculous.
I think
also
again,
helps if you have all those winning lanes as well. You don't necessarily need all those wards to protect that guy who's coming into the mid lane or something.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an aspect that right now people almost are often saying that it's wrong to play the way Samsung White played, right? Which is just to have like 3 winning lanes and then maybe no recourse for later. But I think that one thing that they did to sort of combat what I think Samsung Blue were good at, which was like bouncing the wave on lane swap, because often you could see in like the Samsung White versus Samsung Blue series where Looper would be overextending to get a wave, whereas like Samsung Blue had, because Samsung Blue had bounced the wave correctly, whereas Samsung Blue's top laner Acorn could just go and pick up the wave easily because Samsung White hadn't. I think so they combated that kind of by taking control and taking over the jungle in a sense so that they could get back the losses on that sense, and then also by having the pushing mid so that a lot of times Samsung Blue had to reallocate resources. So if they were ahead in tempo in lane swaps, and you saw this, I think, at least once at Worlds, where Samsung Blue were ahead in tempo on the lane swap, but they used that to go mid and try to reset the wave so that Dade wasn't pushed in. But then as a result, like Samsung White could get the dragon. So I think that in that sense, there were a lot of things that Samsung White was innovating to combat Samsung Blue, and this is kind of like my theory with some of the jungle stuff, is that they took where they were strong and then they made sure that they carved out a path in that sense to combat like what Samsung Blue were already good at. So in that regard, I think looking at these two teams and how they develop simultaneously makes it really, really hard to just isolate Samsung White and say that like all of the stuff was then, right? But in a sense that...
Okay, well, let me ask you this then, Kelsey. Okay, as I kind of alluded to before, like actually a pet peeve of mine in analysis is where people give way too much credit to the person who invented something, as though like if it's almost like I invented it and I have the trademark, so everything you create afterwards, licenses to me. It doesn't work that way outside of basically products. Like if you invent a great concept, by the way, it happened many times in history. Someone invented like the steam engine first, all sorts of things. No one remembers the guy in history. They remember the person who invented the best steam engine and the one that took over the fucking world and was the most successful and made that guy billions of dollars. So actually we can, in most of those instances, unless the person who innovated it also was happened to also have the dual skill set to be able to execute it the best, usually just inventing it doesn't make you the best. So I always say this, it doesn't really matter if you come up with the best strategy. Like, for example, there's many, many cases in esports. It's very rare that the person who's most famous for something invented it, but they're most famous for it because they were the best at it. So do you are you implying that Blue inventing some of this stuff sort of takes away from White's greatness because White didn't create it?
No. I actually think that they invented different things. Like both of these teams were innovators. And so a lot of what Samsung White came up with was to combat what Samsung Blue came up with and vice versa. So I think that you can't really look at one team and say that this was the originator of X and then this was
some of it was in reaction.
Copied.
Yes.
And this team copied, because I think both of these teams were like the first. And now we can see examples of teams that do both things that Samsung Blue and Samsung White do things that both Samsung White and Samsung Blue did better now than what they did then. However, I think it's like at the time, both of these teams were so far ahead in certain aspects that it's really difficult to isolate like what was invented in a response to what, as opposed to like what was really far ahead in this and this and this. And the only thing that I come down to is like the fact that Samsung White had this lane control aspect. They ended up doing certain things better in vision, because one thing that Samsung Blue was ahead of them in vision was setting up for neutrals. So, for example, I think one thing that Samsung White was slow to adapt to in the Champion Summer semifinal was the fact that the priority on Dragon increased because you had Dragon Gold increasing. So Samsung Blue were always to Dragon first, right? And they always had better ward setups. Like there was one time, I think there were a couple of setups where Samsung White went first and they didn't have any wards. Like say they were on blue side, they didn't have any wards in red side blue buff area, right? And so Samsung Blue just collapsed on them from that area and managed to win that fight and get the Dragon and come back into the game from there. So that changed really drastically into Worlds to the point where you had like that famous clip where Pawn goes to the Dragon and is as Jace and is like solo killing people from blue and managed to come down in hammer form on the Dragon and take the Dragon, right? So I think that their priority of Drake drastically increased because it was one of the reasons that they lost to Samsung Blue in Champion Summer. So I don't know if that was like that answer was everywhere, but basically my conclusion is that both teams innovated a lot, and but you can credit Samsung White for I think getting just a little bit further ahead by the end of the year in certain aspects that Blue was already good at, right? So
right, let me ask. Let's bring in the topic then of like when they were trolling or when they appeared to do things that seemed either like, I mean, it's either hubris, either they really just thought they were so good in these moments and they couldn't lose that they could do anything, or they just didn't care and they were doing it, or they were doing it to fuck around and they perhaps didn't mind. Well, I don't think they really thought they were going to lose, but they did things that like essentially weren't necessary. Like the best example ever, obviously, is the classic game I always reference of the TSM example, where it's like you already beat the team twice in a row using really like abusive comps that don't make any sense for what you're doing. So in that scenario, right, it is the World Championship. Almost anyone else in history would go, right, cool, I fucked around for 2 games and won. I just win 3-0 now. And instead they were like, is it possible to somehow be even more stupid with the draft?
To blind invade at level 1 with a terrible draft? Can we win a game if we do that?
Like they were basically the anime character.
Horrible.
They were the anime character who, when they sort of like gain full power, just go like, am I a god? Can I be defeated? You know, like anyone else just goes, no, it's sick. I've got powers and that, you know. So, okay, Kelsey, it sounds like you don't buy this. You think that they weren't trolling.
I think that you can consistently see points where Samsung White would do this, right? And you can say it's hubris, but it was also a point of how they played in general. Like Dandy would do certain blind invades against teams in game 1s in Champion Summer, for example. And like I think he did one against SKTK. So there were examples of them doing this in general, and I think part of
blind invade with a terrible level 1 draft.
Well, it's almost worse to do it as one person, right? Because if you're one person, you're for sure gonna die, right? You're for sure gonna die.
5 people, multiple of you can die.
Multiple of you can die, but there's the chance that not everyone is there, right?
I believe, I'm not entirely sure, but I believe this was before the change in like first blood gold before a certain minute mark. So like you did get full first blood gold, I believe, at this point in time. So it was even stupider. Like it could really swing the game. I'm not sure if that's true, but I believe it was.
Yeah, I think they changed it just because they had spent almost the entire year without that, and then they ramped it slowly back up. So I think it was back to like 400 first blood. That's less important, but I think what is important to talk about is because I feel like Samsung White inherently, part of their style in getting super ahead in the early game, in that sense, was to take certain risks, right? That now people would look at and say, this is terrible. Obviously, the 5-man blind invade is an extreme example, but you can see certain risks that they took over and over again. Like I remember there was the famous trade in the first game of Worlds against Edward Gaming, which obviously I'm going to go back to because of bruised egos, whatever, where I actually think the way Name played that wasn't terrible, even though people said he was going into the wave or whatever, because he ended up burning a lot of Imps cooldowns, including his ult, but then Mata just like 1v2'd the lane because the players were that good. So they could get away with a lot of the shit, right? So I think to an extent, they really banked on that. Because
they definitely did.
Yeah. Because you could see as the game dragged on later, right? They would be forced into situations if Pawn didn't have something like Ziggs, which was super high wave clear mid, they wouldn't be able to constantly like pull people off of Baron, right? Which is what they ended up relying on a lot in the SKT series. was that they could just like clear mid super hard when the enemy team was setting up for Baron. So that would pull the enemy team off Baron because they had to defend their base. And so that allowed them to avoid team fights in a lot of scenarios. But then if they didn't have that kind of like extreme souped up Ziggs setup, they had less than ideal ways of avoiding team fights. And then when they played team fights, Imp was constantly positioned far forward. A lot of the champions they picked in Champion Select just weren't ideal for team fighting in general. So I think for them, like it relied a little bit on them taking that risks, and sometimes they went too far. I mean, arguably in TSM, they were straight up against TSM. They were straight up trolling. Yeah. But which I would agree with that assessment. I think that's fair to say. But I think in general, you can't like discount the fact that risk was an inherent part of the way Samsung White played.
Sure, and I do agree with that as well. And certainly they had a confidence in their abilities, particularly in the early game, to make kind of crazy plays and make them work because they were both individually good enough to pull it off as well as collectively good enough to pull it off. Before I get into that, I will say that there were times when I was casting at OGN and I would see them pick a terrible composition, win a game or lose a game, walk out of the booth of the studio giggling even if they lost, and I'd be like, what's wrong with you guys? Like, you guys make me look bad because I say your comp is terrible, but you're like winning, or you're winning anyway sometimes. So they're like, haha, we know, we're just styling out of, like, was basically the implication, right? And even after the World Championship, I believe I recall that there was a Korean press interview where they were specifically asking them about like that game versus TSM and what the fuck they were doing. Mm-hmm. Because it was so obvious to people who weren't blind NA fans that was the case. To go back to what you were saying though about the risk taking, mm-hmm. It also did result in brilliant plays, because remember that there was that level 1 when Looper was playing Singed against TSM in game 2, I believe. It was game 1 or game 2.
Yeah, game 2 was the one they won where he played Singed.
But if you recall, the level 1 team fight with the teleport use was probably the best play of the entirety of Worlds. Like, it was so incredible how they punished TSM's level 1, and TSM had no like counterplay to it, and it wasn't something you could practice. It was literally just something that they made up on the fly after seeing what TSM was doing, and it resulted in, for me, what was the best moment of all of 2014 Worlds.
I think that was also, that's one thing that we haven't really brought up a lot yet, was just how highly Samsung White valued teleport advantage. I think a lot of people think of this as a team that focused so hard on bot lane, and that's true. But a lot of times the first gank would go to top, so that they would force the enemy team top laner to teleport back in, and then they could safely and easily play around bot. This was in standard lane scenarios, obviously. But I think that kind of thing has gone overlooked a lot, because people talk about like how Looper was on an island and he's a teleport god, but Samsung White as a team collectively prioritized having that sort of advantage.
That's where the joke about, Looper being Mata's third summoner spell came from, where he could just summon Looper into his lane. And that was, I definitely was the focus.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I kind of come down like halfway between the two positions on the whole trolling aspect, because the problem is, like, first of all, if you know anything about the behind-the-scenes context of that team, even going back to when they were Ozone and they had Dade, because obviously it was only one player switch, they were a team where, like, it's funny because half the teams who played them were like, they are the best team to ever play in scrims that has ever existed. And the other half of the people who played them was sometimes like, oh, sometimes they would just fuck around and do whatever. And it's like, if you actually combine the two together, it basically just says a more extreme version of the first thing I said, which is that as far as I can tell from everyone who played them, they were basically the best team ever off stage, probably to ever play League of Legends. Like, they could just wreck everyone so hard. They would purposely do things like pick terrible lanes just to show the person.
They would. I mean, I can tell you straight up against CLG, Dandy was playing shit like Fiddlesticks jungle against us because he gave no fucks, and they were still smashing CLG constantly.
So if you know that context, then first of all, you can see where the arrogance would come from, because basically when everyone's not on stage, they are just so far ahead of some of the other teams. And then you add in that one of the traditional themes of League of Legends, which actually makes the game a little bit whack, I have to say, is that the higher the stakes are in an official stage game, the more like safe people play. And so you have all these teams where you hear these great stories, oh, they're amazing in scrims, and then what happens is they don't do any of that shit on stage. They just sit there and hope somehow they're going to automatically win the game by laning or something. Whereas actually Samsung White basically thought, well, we can do the shit we're doing in scrims. We'll just go into the game. Yeah, well, the other team's just trying to play set. We'll just go and we'll set up and invade, and we'll try and catch this guy when he goes to place a ward here. And it sounds ridiculous because it can't work all the time. But I've noticed in general, if you look in esports, generally the really skilled players love risky scenarios because obviously they're so good at it, they can apply that risk to then be like 4 kills up on you in a scenario where even a sane person would only be 2 kills up, because you kind of, it's a difference between waiting for a scenario to present itself and saying, right, I'll take advantage of that, or going, I'll just create this scenario. There's a reason why winners believe in luck so much, because they think you create your own luck. So, okay, the basic concise version of that is, I do think they were trolling in a way because they were way too abusive with it. But at the same time, every time it worked, everyone gives them a standing ovation and says, oh, fucking genius, look at that. And then every time it doesn't work, people are like, oh, idiots, what are we doing? So, well, it can't work every time, can it? Come on. You haven't just solved the game. You haven't completed League of Legends, have you? It has to fail sometime.
I also think part of why a lot of people who scrimmed both teams, Samsung White and Samsung Blue, came out at around Worlds time, came out so highly on Samsung White relatively, was because I hear that Dade is just notorious for not just trolling, but kind of like not giving a fuck, and maybe
he was terrible.
Sitting in lane. Yeah,
Samsung Blue was notoriously bad in scrims. CLG would beat them occasionally in scrims, right? Whereas we were just getting bodied constantly by Samsung White, and sometimes Samsung Blue looked like they didn't even give a fuck about what, about doing anything, experimenting, winning a scrim. They were just sort of like sitting there taking punches and just rolling over and dying. So they were really weird to scrim against, honestly, because, obviously I knew they could play a lot better than that because I had cast all their games that year. So it was, and other teams I think also had similar experiences with Samsung Blue. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have been taken seriously. In fact, if you look at what was by far the most dominating series, paradoxically, at the World Championship during the playoffs, was the Samsung White 3-0 over Samsung Blue. There was no bullshit there. Yes. It didn't look like they were trolling. It was like they were scared of Blue still because of their traumatic losses in previous semifinals, and they were not giving them any room at all to come back in that scenario.
And talk about wave clear mids, you have Jace 2 games, right? Which is just like literally stand back, queue every wave. All right, excellent. So,
and plus also that's another aspect that I mean I can't say I know which way to come down on it myself, but the other problem I've always had with the Samsung teams at that Worlds is you have both scenarios happen at the same time seemingly. So Samsung White now like goes into God mode, and then Blue just takes a dip that was like uncharacteristic for how they play the entire rest of the year. Like, okay, we know that they lost that final to KT Arrows, but KT Arrows had to play like out of their mind, super risky, doing all sorts of crazy shit.
Yeah, Kakao had to like become a god during that.
So the idea that one team went up and the other one went down at the same time, that is mysterious in a way. So that's why I find it hard to say that makes one team better or worse in that sense,
I do think the way that Samsung Blue played relied a lot on them having some sort of patch advantage to an extent, just because if you're going to play against Samsung White and you're going to have losing lanes almost across the board, then it's really hard for Dade to even get enough pressure to roam without just losing mid turret entirely. And so if you're functioning off of that sort of aspect, then you're not going to do well. Also, they really, like, almost every time that they played White, I felt like they abused Dragon, they abused Baron setups really, really well. And then Samsung White kind of changed some of the ways that they approached vision in those games. They changed the way that they approached side lanes so that Blue couldn't come back. So at the World Championship, so it almost felt like the improvements Samsung White made were specifically to defeat Blue at that tournament. So every game that they played was just like the changes that they made were against Blue. Obviously, that makes sense.
They were the only legitimate threat at that tournament.
They were the only real threat.
Like KT Arrows peaked super hard, never even made it to Worlds, right? Mm-hmm. It was pretty clear that Najin's shield was not going to do shit. So you had to go, like, the only real threat were the Samsung teams to each other. So,
yep, exactly. So it's just really interesting to me because you have Samsung Blue winning twice and then Samsung White developing strategy specifically to defeat Blue, knowing how Blue play. And Blue, I felt like, changed a lot less between champions and worlds. So like that factor is really interesting. So
I think you really bring up an interesting point about Dade too, because Dade is like one of I think the most interesting players that we've ever had in League of Legends, because he was so incredibly fucking good for a time. But also, I feel like neither team really used him optimally, because if you think about what were Dade's strengths, his strengths were like roaming assassins and team fighting. Right. Okay. So we'd say these are like his two biggest strengths as a player. But when he was on MVP Ozone, the team that became white, and they won that really famous final against what was CJ Blaze at the time, when CJ Blaze was like an enormous favorite, and then MVP Ozone 3-0'd them because of the Zach and the Zed pick and everything like that that happened. And Dade was like the best player in that series. And then, so he's on this team that he can roam and try and snowball the lanes, but he doesn't really have a strong team fighting team around him when he was always a great team fighter. We think about it, especially his Ziggs play, which was so crazy in terms of his team fight potential. And then he gets on to blue, and like you're saying, at this point he can team fight, but he can't really roam. Like the Zed, the TF, like they're not as strong on this blue roster necessarily as they would be on the Samsung white roster. So it's really frustrating because I feel like we never got to see the perfect team for Dade in a way.
Which is what? Season 3 SK Telecom pick comp or something?
Yeah, basically, yeah. Like probably like if he had been on SKT instead of Faker, like maybe that would have been the best team for him.
Okay. I think actually the innovations that we've brought up that Samsung White brought to the table kind of ruined Dade's style of play. Because I think in order to roam, like Samsung White made it so that you have to be able to push out your wave and not lose like a ton off of going to a side lane. And Dade's strengths and the champions that he picked, I mean, aside from maybe Twisted Fate, and then like Zed can obviously have a certain amount of pressure, but his strengths as an individual were never to like crush his lane or to have his lane pushed out. And his champion pool, in a sense, was somewhat limited. So I felt like Dade as a player couldn't necessarily play as well in this scenario that White created, where you push out the wave, you roam with your jungler into the enemy place, you get wards down, so you make it like really difficult for the mid to gain pressure. And in a way, Samsung Blue, when they played against Samsung White, like I said, had to lose some tempo in lane swaps by having like support jungle go to mid and try to reset the wave off of what they had already on priority. So I think, in a sense, the way that Samsung White played made Dade's preferred style almost kind of irrelevant over time. So,
okay, I have to say
it's true, because like when Dade was at his peak, and we think about his Twisted Fate play, I mean, sometimes he'd kill like all 3 lanes in the first 10 or 15 minutes of the game. He was just an incredible savant. But what we think about, and we go back to the finals of 2013, and we think about him playing Zed, what was he doing? These were like super deep dives. Like he would be there like assassinating you at your second turret and crazy shit.
He was literally tower diving Flame, who already was playing versus a Zac that you can't kill at the beginning of the game anyway. So like you don't expect someone to do that. But then again, I mean, funny thing about that is that's another example of hubris. Like we have a team where our entire plan is that we must let this guy farm and get to the late game, or you are going balls deep, diving us all the time at the beginning. How could we have seen it coming? But that's sadly just the way the game is, right?
Yeah, and if you're pushing out the wave, you're against Dade, you're restricting him to his lane, and you're cutting out like a lot of what he can do on the map. So I think that was a really good approach to take against Samsung Blue. And once people figured it out and Dade failed to adapt, like there was a reason in China his best champion was Victor, right? He took a really long time to learn Victor, but Victor had the ability to like E the wave and then just be fine. And so I think that was a big aspect of what helped Dade fall off, was just the rise of White and White coming to dominance and people studying White in the way that White played around the jungle. So.
Didn't you once, Monty, now listen, you're not in League of Legends anymore, we can bring this up. Didn't you once make me delete a bit from an episode of Someone Insight where I said, you see, Monty, thanks to White winning Worlds, we can now say it was a white supremacy or something like that. And it was one of the only times in history you ever made me delete something.
By the way, I had to be very careful when I was casting not to talk about Samsung White's power.
Okay.
A lot of the time, there were a lot of like combinations of words that were super dangerous.
but yeah, that's a little spoiler for people there. It's the Easter egg. It's the only time we ever actually did delete something from some of the insight, because I did say, like something that could be clipped so badly.
You're welcome, by the way. I saved you from being attacked by.
Well, you just delayed it a bit. You delayed it a few years, mate. I was always going to get there at the end anyway. Don't worry.
He just saved it.
You just said it again, so now it could be taken out of context.
I'm bulletproof at this point in time. Right. One of the things, though, that I found so funny, and I think actually some fans still think of this way a little bit when they talk about the Samsung White team, is they still think that it was like a super team, which, listen, this is another pet peeve of mine. Like, super teams are not teams that get to the top and then you think everyone's the best. Like, super teams are created with super players, and it actually has nothing to do with whether you succeed or not. Like, that's actually a misnomer about the term. But that notion, which definitely was living large after Season 4 Worlds, that, like, not only were they the best team, they had all the best players, is like, this is episode 7,000 of you are all wrong, you are always wrong, because in no universe were Looper and Pawn, for 1 second in their lives, the best at their roles.
Even
I realize,
maybe not.
That was debatable, but yeah, he was probably definitely like Uzi, etc. were right at his level. Name, he had a lot of competition, but in no universe were Pawn and Looper the best top laner and mid laner. If as you've heard by this description here, they actually had very sort of limited roles within their fucking team, and they just sort of had to do X, Y, and Z, and then wait for someone to tell them to do Z. That was like their job in the team. Like, as a lot of people would have loved to have had that job. That's like being the fucking like backing singer for like Michael Jackson or something, isn't it? Like, you are not one of the best singers in the world as well. You are just singing behind Michael Jackson. And your job, maybe don't sing too much while Michael Jackson is doing his solo, like. I mean, we've seen their careers before and
definitively after. The best players on that team were Mata and Dandy.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think the secret, though, if you're a coach and you just want your players to be regarded as the best players in the region or in the league, is to every single game, don't care that much about team comp. Just pick winning lanes across the board, right?
Yes.
And then they'll win every lane, and people will think that they are the sickest players, even if you lose. So I think that's the ultimate secret there.
Yeah.
So the fact that Samsung White picked winning lanes across the board, it's no coincidence. Like, it's similar things can be said about Longju and KT this year, right? Is that those were teams that constantly picked winning lanes. And so, of course, their players look like the absolute best in the league because they're constantly besting their opponents 1v1. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are straight up players. They're getting bonuses from playing champions in good matchups, from having a coach that does draft in that regard very well. So I think that that's something that people can't really separate very well when they're
here's the funny thing as well, right? I'll take what Monty said there and I'll actually take it a step further. So I kind of like sounded like I was ragging on Pawn and Looper by saying that, they were only allowed to do certain things and then they had to just wait for someone to tell them to, right? That's not actually ragging on them. If you've seen them in their career when they had more freedom, they just weren't that good as players. That's the only way they could have been in the best team. But it's even worse than that. I'd go further than that. If you look at the way, like, Imp obviously was one of the players who was the most horny to go balls deep on every single play. And it's not that matter like getting reined in, it's just that he sort of decided when he would help him do that and when he would just let him feed, basically. So I would even go as far as to say that basically that team was Dandy and Mata, and then they just knew, like, they essentially knew how to use the other pieces. Like, they knew, like, okay, so we've got Looper, he's a pawn, obviously. We've got Pawn himself. Maybe not a pawn, maybe he can be like a bishop, he can only go diagonally, Like, Imp's sort of like, maybe he's like a castle or a knight or something. But we know who the best pieces on the board are. And I've actually brought this up to Monty before because a lot of people didn't see this, and someone pointed out to me one time, and it is hilarious. But there is this clip on the official Riot stream where Samsung wins this Worlds, right? And the second they win the Worlds, the fireworks go off, and I can't remember if there was confetti for that one, and they're in that stadium in Seoul. And what happens is, right, because of the thing about how you set up the lineup on a desk, like Mata and Dandy aren't sat next to each other. In fact, I think Dandy was like second from the right, like their view, and I think Mata was like at the very end on the left or something. They were like almost as far apart as you could be. And what happens is when they win, you can go watch this video. I'll link it on this video if I remember. When they win, they get up, and what's brilliant is they have to run past at least two other teammates. They run past the other teammates, grab each other, and sort of like hug as if like, we did it. Yes, we did it. While the others just sort of bemused look around like, It was cool getting to see them win worlds or something. Like, what? That's what I love about it. It wasn't a super team, guys. It wasn't. They just made it look like that. It was but distraction, smoke and mirrors.
It's actually kind of funny because people point out how frequently Deft dies in lane, but I think partly because of how aggressively Mata and Imp played the lane, you would see them get ganked a lot. And so Imp would actually die in lane consider quite frequently. So I think it's funny that even though Imp and Mata were a good laning duo, like people sort of conveniently forget that fact that Imp's positional awareness in lane wasn't the best. So I think it's interesting.
I think that's a lot of that's because people tended to watch or remember these teams based on their series against each other. And that's where Deft died constantly. I mean, there is if you really want to see there's a game, I'm trying to remember if it was spring or summer playoffs, where it's the game where Deft dies something like 7 times in lane, but Blue still wins the game.
I think it might have been against Stealths in the summer. Was that it?
No. It was a white versus.
Oh, right. It was in spring, I think. Right. Yeah. So
it was a white versus blue game where Imp and Mata kill Deft 7 times in the laning phase, something really, really ridiculous. And Blue still wins the game in the end because they have better dragon control and team fighting. And that was the most quintessential style match, white versus blue style matchup that you could see. So if you want to see the dynamic between these teams in a nutshell, you should watch that game because I loved that game because it was so symbolic of their entire year of performances that it was super enjoyable.
I'll give you another reason. Yeah, okay. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, in contrast, if you remember in the summer, there was a game where Mata is just roaming with Dandy the entire time, and Hart legit solo kills Imp's Kog'Maw with Morgana. Which was pretty entertaining. But yeah, go ahead.
I'll give you another reason. It's obviously a very circumstantial, contextual one, but another reason why I actually think you have to look at this Samsung one and they could be the greatest team is because, as we've kind of alluded to here, at no point did we ever mention the genius coach who came up with all this and who designed it. This is probably the closest to a world champion Korean team who it almost looked like there wasn't a coach. They decided what the fuck they were doing. They did whatever they wanted. They won worlds off the back of it and had sort of, at league at that point in time, solved the league at that point. I mean, admittedly, you need the best players. So it's the same argument when people, if you want to contrast quarterbacks in the NFL, the difference is Peyton Manning was his own offensive coordinator as well.
Yeah,
he didn't just have some super sick offensive coach who was I'll put the right players around you and do it. No, he did himself, didn't he? So you get double points when you do that,
And if you see the way Mata's teams have played since then, it's very they have very similar themes, right? You have Royal Never Give Up in 20. We try to pretend 2015 never happened, right? You have Royal Never Give Up in 2016, which was very much about having winning lanes and going in that extent. And then that actually really informed the way that RNG played in 2017 as well. And they always talked about how Mata taught them so much about the game and just really changed the way that they were looking at it, even the way that they were laning and everything in that regard. And then you go to KT, and KT have similar strengths and similar flaws to Samsung White as well this year. They like to play towards bot lane. They like to play with winning lane matchups. They like to play. They're very
they can't
bad
play
at
the late game.
Yeah, they can't play the late game in part because they have what I think is kind of the hallmark Mata flaw, which is not resetting after you get a certain amount of objectives. You just keep pushing as far as you can until the enemy team respawns with items and kills you. So I think that
Mata is not aware of the concept of tantric sex. And there's the title of the episode. There we go. Sometimes I just know it when it happens. Okay, I just Okay, then let's go back to a topic from before then. So when you have the discussion of are they the greatest team ever, etc., it obviously helps if you can contrast them with other teams. So what do you how would you contrast Samsung White with some of the SK Telecom teams that won Monty? How would you say what pros and cons or strengths, or how would you judge the power level? Because obviously they can't technically have literally played each other, even though technically the Season 3 one did play them. It's just that, half of them were dead and skill vampired to oblivion.
I think they were probably most similar to the Season 3 SK Telecom team, because that was a team that was mostly based around winning lane matchups and pick compositions at their most successful. Whereas if we think about the identity shift, like obviously the collapse of SKT during Season 4, and then they had a very serious identity shift between the Season 5 and Season 7, which was that they started to play a pretty conservative early game where they would often fall behind, but were extremely strong at late game objective control, which was, by the way, entirely different to the SKTs that we saw in their sort of inaugural year of 2013. So I think they were probably most similar to that kind of style of SK Telecom. But still, they were more, obviously at the time they were more advanced in terms of their jungle and support. There really wasn't another team, I think, that stylistically was similar to them, but that was probably the most similar.
I think that's probably one of the more frustrating things about how the Korean team narrative has developed, is that it's almost entirely been dominated by the shifts in play style of SKT that you referenced, which is that they're teams that like hold off, and then they have good mid-game to late-game control, and then they went off of that. When I feel like there have been so many strong Korean teams, like Samsung White is held up and regarded as one of the greatest teams of all time, that have had very different styles of play that kind of get disregarded. And so people say that the Korean style is whatever SKT is playing. So I think that it's very good to highlight Samsung White's differences with the way that SKT has been playing for the past couple of years, for people who think that Samsung White is a similar team, because they really aren't at all.
No, because even Faker's champion pool has changed pretty dramatically from his early days of his career, where he was primarily an assassin player. I mean, we think about early Faker, we think about, of course, LeBlanc, which is a champion that he hugely innovated in 2013, Zed, Ari. These kind of picks were like his big picks that he was making all these flashy plays on. But later on, we see many more control mages out of Faker, and it's much more about playing with the pace of the game rather than making big outplays or opportunities by himself.
Which I think also ties into, as his team's degraded, and then he obviously, in some of the later teams, I think it all plays into the same factor, which is that when you have weaknesses, you have to cover those weaknesses. And so sometimes that means using some of the strength of the star player to cover the weaknesses. It's not like you just say, right, I've got Faker, so I'm just going to put him on something that'll smash lane, he'll kill everyone. That doesn't matter if you lose so hard in the bot lane and the top laner gets killed 24/7. Everyone's played a solo queue game. It doesn't matter how much the one guy gets in the mid lane in that sense, So I think actually that's one of the aspects of the Korean scene I've always found very interesting, because part of the reason why I think they've had this predilection to play more around objective control and play like late game comps, etc., is because that is the safest way to win the game. You can actually win the game there just by your brains and decision making without having to do some crazy outplays. But that's also because I think the weirdest thing about League of Legends is, I guess it's not that dissimilar to other team sports, you can't really load up super teams. They don't traditionally really work. I mean, KT obviously this year is the ultimate example. Like, as a game, because it is so focused on team play, just having the best players almost can be a limiting factor. Because I've always felt like when you have a normal team, you usually, let's say normally you have, say, 2-star players, someone else pretty good, and then like you usually have like one player who's not as good or one player who just fits this team. He's not that good outside the context of the team. Everyone knows which way their bread is buttered there. Like, Lupa's never going to be like, I think this game I'll have the counter pick and dominate the top. No. We all know where the picks are going, and that actually streamlines the process and lets us know how to win the game.
Depends on which FPL caster you ask. Anyway, continue.
Whereas this year, if you look at the KT team from this year, that is the ultimate example of where half of where I thought they failed wasn't even in the game. It was stuff like they didn't even know how they wanted to play. They would be like, oh, we've got the best top laner, so do we give him this pick now, or do we actually do we play through the AD? Well, which one do we do? And then half the time, it looked like they were like, right, well, we did that last game and lost. Can I have the pick this time? It's like, this isn't any way for a team to... No world champion's going to work that way. Like, that's not reasonable. Nearly every team that was great had a style of play and just refined and executed that style of play to win.
I think it's a bit of a shame that people see Samsung, even though Risk was definitely an aspect of the Samsung Light play style, people tend to either think just completely mischaracterize Samsung White's playstyle, or they just think it's completely dominated by Risk in a sense, and that it only worked because those players were so good. Because I think there is something to be said for that, but I also think that there are ways to play the way Samsung White played, and actually like Longju and has tried to play that way to an extent, and they've won LCK with like winning lanes, and then you saw the Samsung Galaxy and SKT both went for much more early game winning lanes as the tournament progressed at 2017 Worlds. So I think that in general, it doesn't necessarily have to be an inherently risk-based way to play. There are ways that you can, it's almost riskier in a sense to play the way Samsung Blue did. Like that has its own risks to it, right? Because you're relying on the enemy team inherently to make a mistake at some point.
It's like this, Kelsey.
So that you can get into the game.
As someone who watched a million games of classic era Blaze with Ambition and Flame, that is actually, it's in some sense, it's the most compelling style to watch, because you're trying to walk a fucking tightrope for 40 minutes. And if you do it and you don't fall off, you win the game and it looks like you were a genius who could never be beaten. The problem is, if one thing goes wrong at a couple of points, you fall off and are fucked. And it's like, well, maybe we should have taken a different approach to this, you know?
At the same time, though, if you play like Samsung White played and are able to secure ridiculous amounts of gold, like you can fuck off a lot more. You can fall, you can trip, you can do a lot more different things that you wouldn't normally be able to do if you had an even game. So at the same time, like it's really, if you're playing a dominant early game style and you have, after that point, vision in the right place, you're dealing with side lanes correctly, you can have a very dominant closeout after that, even if you don't have champions that scale completely perfectly. Whereas I think if you're playing just like all scaling champs, you're kind of relying on the fact that no one's perfect. Someone's going to fuck up at some point. You're going to have a team fight that allows you to come back in the game. So either way, you're either having faith in yourself to like not make catastrophic mistakes, or you're having faith in the enemy team to make catastrophic mistakes, I think. So.
Well, I mean, that's the beauty of when Samsung White did do those mad aggro things, as you say, they could then make mistakes because they made you make mistakes. It's like, you know, everyone loses in war, but you lose more. Like,
so I've been trying to figure out what the game I was talking about earlier, where Imp died Def died so many times in lane. I believe, looking at these scoreboards, that it was game 1 of the Champions Summer semifinal.
Okay.
Right.
I'm not sure because I'm not looking at the actual game right now, but just for those people who are interested in which one that was, I think it was that one. I'm like 90% sure. So that was a very interesting series. And just one of the things that I think was so cool about this matchup is that we got to see it so consistently, right, in best of fives. We got to see it in semis in spring, semis in summer, semis at Worlds. So we kind of got to see it back to back to back. So it's really cool if you guys want to go back and watch something that won't take, obviously going to take you a long time to watch 3 best of fives. But if you want to see the real development and storyline of these teams, I'm sure I talk a lot about the matchups while I'm casting them in there. So you can go back and check those out. And it's pretty fun to revisit those moments.
Well, actually, I will say, Monty, that's one thing that I've noticed. No one else has ever commented on this, but one of the things I actually always did appreciate about your commentary is that you would always, first of all, at the beginning of every game on the VOD for OGN, you would always mention what patch it was that you were on, what the recent change was, and then in the pick ban, you wouldn't just say, oh, they can pick this, which allows them to do X and Y. You would be like, this player hasn't picked this before this season. You know, the actual contextual information was really good for me personally, because obviously I came into League of Legends late. You know, I wasn't there for 4 years before to know what every one of these players had done. So that's one of those things where, I mean, I can't blame modern casters. They are just casting for the live audience that's watching now, but I've always appreciated when people add in contextual stuff like that, because it actually does, like, the whole point is this notion that a beginner doesn't want to have lots of information. No, they really want to know what's going on. It's just that they can't understand if you don't give them the context.
You can't tell the story properly if the audience doesn't know why something is exciting or unique. So I do, thank you. I try, and that's good. I'm glad I succeed in doing that, because I definitely try, and whenever I cast a game, to provide that kind of information so that people know why to get excited, right? Or why something is fun to watch.
Okay, here's a topic that's a great one for this discussion, because another reason why I think Samsung White are, in some people's eyes, the best team ever. It's because they went out at their absolute peak. You never got to see what happened. Like when I say it, like personally, I might pick season 3 SK Telecom as the best team ever. But the problem is, you're all now thinking, but I saw that team in season 4 getting their shit pushed in all the time. And so it kind of does take away the luster. Even though you should just isolate it to when they were the best, you know what it was like to see them mortal. So they had that whole thing of like the Bo Jackson type scenario where it's like, well, no one knows what happens when that guy plays 5 more seasons, and if he goes downhill, if it's not as good. So in this scenario, what would have happened?
Well,
if season 4 Samsung White could have gone into season 5?
To be fair to these teams, they had been, because we can't talk about either of these teams without saying that they were together for a long time, even when they were shit. Like MVP Blue used to be shit, and it had all of these players on it, right? Well, obviously except for Bade, but
yeah, it had 3 of them.
Yeah, a lot of these players were on this roster, and same thing with the MVP Ozone, the team that became MVP, or that was sold, that became Samsung Ozone, that became Samsung White. But these were players, and I think that I talk about MVP a lot in the broader context of esports as probably being the best team in the world at identifying talent because of how many teams they've run from, you know, rookies who are absolute trash into like being world champions. They've done it in like a bunch of different games. They actually have a remarkable ability to coach and players and to identify talent. But this was a scenario where we had actually seen a pretty long tail on some of these teams. But yes, they definitely went out at their peak. And when I think about how they would have done the next season, it's really hard to know because the next season was like if we talk about 2014 as being the best year of League of Legends, 2015 was the shittiest. Like it was like the worst year of League of Legends because we went from basically all the Koreans being contained in Korea and having to fight amongst themselves on 16 teams, and we have all these legendary players, superstars that were all competing together, who then were scattered across the globe like Dragon Balls, and you know you never could ever assemble them back together again to get the fulfill your wish of another great League of Legends season. So had they stayed, they probably would have dominated because everybody else would have left and the scene would have been really weak. Are we asking the question, what if Korean players had never been allowed to leave Korea? Because that's a very different story.
I think it's interesting because to an extent, playing the way that Samsung White played around jungle and stuff would have probably been caught up to. But I think if we could have just froze that team in time, waited through 2015, most of 2016, and then dropped them into 2016 World Championship when they had that sudden patch change to standard lanes only, we actually could have had that team be extremely dominant in that setting. Because I felt like one thing that
thought experiment
they fell short at a little bit, and one of their only like super early game flaws was just the way that they did the rotation in terms of the lane swap, and that was something that Samsung Blue was always better at. But the way that Samsung White played around jungle and having pushing lanes and was actually really well suited for the 2016 World Championship and the sudden patch change to standard lanes. I think that would have been something that they could have excelled at if they had sort of like even just not having changed all that much. I actually think that their style was almost anachronistic in a sense and would have been better suited for that World Championship. So,
well, just to put it in context for people who don't remember, I would definitely agree, by the way. I think that spring season 5 LCK was the worst fucking champions ever. All you need to know is these 3 different pieces of information. Okay, so I'm gonna characterize the 3 best teams in Korea for you, and when you hear this, just think about that in the context of everything else we talked about before and afterwards. So the team that came 3rd that year was CJ Entus, who had Space still. Ambition had just turned into a jungler, and they almost won that semi against SKT.
That was a really good semi, to be
primarily
fair.
Because the first 2 games they played Tom, and then they played Easyhoon the first game, because that leads into another detail. SK Telecom was able to win this LCK while fucking around trying to win on Nightmare mode without Faker. Yes, they didn't even use Faker in the final. They used Easyhoon, who again is not a god. Anyone who thought that again, you got fooled again. You got pawned for a second time in a row, but never learned from that, okay? So they won on Nightmare mode. And why did they win on Nightmare mode? Because the only real team that could challenge them, the Rocks Tigers, sadly, GE Tigers at the time, sadly, as we then found out, was one of the most mentally frail teams to be ever that good, probably ever to play League of Legends. Like, that's a team that could have won so many titles and world champ. You know, it's actually torturous. So SKT almost waltzed to that championship, you know, as opposed to the years we were talking about. It was like matchup dependent entirely as to where you went in the league. You know, if you got the wrong team at the wrong time, good luck. You go into the quarterfinals and that's it. Otherwise, you might be going to the finals.
Well, it's also easy to, I think fans don't, you know, they think about Faker and they think about his dominance and all the world championships that he's won. And if you weren't watching Korea in 2014, it's not like Faker was having a bad season. Faker was actually still playing super well. It's that the level of competition was so fucking high in Korea at the time that Faker couldn't just like hard carry his team to victory. And
well, especially because he was having to play like Ziggs. He basically played in that season like Froggen did when he was on his bad teams, where all he could do is just hope I can farm up, survive, and then, oh, we lost the game already. Like that, you don't suck because of that. There's nothing you could have done, right? You don't have a team.
I do wonder how much of that was coaching, because SKTS was literally probably the most boring League of Legends team I've ever had to watch, because it was absolutely horrible to cast their games because of the wave clear and Easy Hoon playing Ziggs for like an hour every game, and they were fucking awful to watch. But if you just think about the level of talent that was in Korea at that time, it's ridiculous. Like, even the mid lane competition for Faker was ridiculous. This was like Dade at his peak, Pawn playing pretty well. It was like fucking Rookie going off on people. Like, it was just nuts how good this league was and how hype it was to see every matchup, basically.
Yeah, I think it was almost.
That was when Goong was having a super good year too. Like, Goong was on fire for a while in that season. Save was actually good in the top lane.
I noticed all three of the players, Dade, Goong, and Save, ended up having massive champion pool issues to an extent. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Dade was not having champion pool issues at the time, to be fair.
Within that meta, he did not have champion
Goong and Save, you could make that argument for.
But I think that you can highlight the fact that he was slow to change his champion pool, at least. So.
Okay. Is that the end of the show? Do we have any final way to address this topic? Come on, Kelsey. There's something you haven't said so far.
I mean, I think that really the point that I want to hammer home is that Samsung White wasn't good at every aspect of the game, but they were extremely.
Well, we said that at the time.
Yeah. I know you said that at the time, but it's like the way that the narrative has mutated and exaggerated, like how they were. So the fact that they were extremely ahead in certain sense, and that allowed them to be a very strong team above where they were. And I think that it's arguable that they were clearly the strongest team for the course of a tournament. Definitely, and more than arguable, I think we'd all agree that there wasn't a team that was as good as Samsung White at that World Championship. However, I guess it's up to you to say whether or not that makes them the greatest team of all time. I personally don't think it does, but
I think a lot of this narrative came from the mysticism that was the Western teams encountering Samsung White in scrims prior to Worlds. Yeah. I think that actually had the biggest effect. And I understand that because CLG, when I was coaching them, was the first team to encounter them in that environment from the West, right? And I remember just being like mind fucked by like how good they were and so confused about how to even begin to defeat them. And you know, I had seen them play many times, but it was their jungle and vision innovations towards World Championship that were really scary. And that was the big difference between when I had seen them play before and what I was watching in scrims. And obviously, they only played a couple games against CLG, so I also had very limited data to figure out what the best way to defeat them was. And I think that's what everybody encountered, because they all obviously had blue to scrim against. They didn't have to scrim against any of the other teams. So I think they would just roll in basically to the other teams for a couple scrim blocks here and there over the course of Worlds prep, absolutely, completely blow the other team the fuck out. And then the teams are like sitting there being like, well, what the fuck do I do against this? Like, I don't actually have enough information to make a reliable game plan, but I also just got my ass handed to me. And I think that all of these teams all these players, all these coaches. I'll just blame Loco Doco because I remember him being very loud about this. I know it's not your fault, Loco, but you were one of many voices. But I remember him specifically, like super hyping them up. But they never saw the flaw, which always existed. And to this day, we don't really know if this flaw still existed. We can say, okay, well, they did over the course of the year have a bad late game. But as we touched on earlier, they never really reached the late game.
Plus, think about this. They had a bad late game. Well, who's the only team beating them? The team that had by far the best late game in the world.
Yes.
So that also feels like, oh, what did they only have the second best late game? Well, fuck, what? That's weakness, guys. It's not really much of a weakness if only one person can exploit it.
I think it's fair to kind of look at games where they would fall behind and not just compositionally. They would struggle, like, because those games, they tended to have poor team compositions and screw up fundamentally in the early game, but they did not necessarily understand how to create opportunities for comebacks or how to like properly like push out the waves or set up for Barons so that they could get, like, they went from a team that would have ideally setups for pick comps, even if their composition was bad, and then they wouldn't set up for that. They would like group around Baron or group around some objective and get slaughtered, or super hard push the enemy turret after one successful team fight or something and then die there. So I think you can say that based on the evidence, at least the macro weaknesses of their late game play and their mid game play still existed, apart from some of the adaptations they made around sidewave pushes. But these were still based on having a lead, right? Like the way that they did mid game minion control advanced and got much better, but it was in scenarios where they had a lead already. So I think that that's still a criticism that you can levy against them based on the small amount of data that we had.
Well, part of the problem there is, like, this reminds me of the story. I remember when I actually first talked to Froggen when that Alliance team he made was, like, initially doing really badly. And I said to him, like, come on, man, it's been like 3 weeks now. You're losing all the games. What the fuck's this? And he was like, well, what do you expect? In practice, when the games never go past 10 minutes. Like, we're winning so hard. We have literally never played a game that was like 20 minutes long, you know? So, yeah, no one knows what to do. So in that sense, right, the fact that Samsung White, especially in these scrims, was so unreal early game, they never win the position. It's like, okay, when I moved to Amsterdam, okay, whenever I would go to cross the road, I had to consciously stop and go, you're supposed to look right first, because in England, obviously, cars drive on the other side of the road. So basically, think about it logically. My entire life, a key reason I'm still alive, because I jaywalk like a motherfucker, by the way. I don't wait till the cars stop, right? And one of the main reasons I am still alive now to be in this position is because I always look left. Because, actually, no, it's the other way around. You look right first, because obviously they're coming to your left when you're crossing, right? So in that scenario, I have been trained to essentially live in England and die in any other country, because I will be looking the wrong way. So I can only get to the position to die because I was trained to do the opposite thing. So in that sense, I don't really blame them for being that bad at late game macro.
There you go. You have G2's entire 2017 spring coaching philosophy, which is just don't try to win the early game. And then you have the opposite problem. You have no idea what to do in the early game. So there you go.
It's okay, Kelsey. Don't worry. This time the host isn't against you. This isn't a 2v1 fucking...
Wait, what happened?
Right, she did it. She naively accepted a challenge from Weldon to do a public debate.
Okay, was it naive? I knew. I just want to clarify.
No, but this is the best part, Monty. So LS was the host. And when I say host, he really just agreed with Weldon and they just double-teamed her the whole time.
I want to point out that I wasn't naive.
I agreed with you, Kelsey, about almost everything in there. So it was super funny for me to watch that. That was like the least biased host, or like the most biased hosting that I've ever fucking seen.
I just want to clarify that I wasn't naive. I was just stupid, arguably, because I knew that a lot of Weldon's ideas came from LS, so...
No, I mean, I think you were, listen, I don't think you were naive in terms of that. You were just naive in terms of thinking that anyone in the public would watch someone get... Like, you have to understand, this is why public debates are just worthless nowadays. They don't ever get to the bottom of a topic. If you just look like you're winning and, for example, just pressure the other person all the time and say, yeah, but defend this point here, it looks like you're winning. It's like what happens in MMA, famously. If you just, like, sort of walk the other guy down all the time, you can actually take a bit more damage. It looks like you're winning, though, because why is he backing off? But, like, that doesn't... In a debate, unfortunately, no one's going to stop and go, well, she did make a great point. They're going to go, well... Why didn't either of them agree with her?
Or they're going to say, like, what about this? Whenever you bring up a point, right?
Yeah,
and deflect away from the main point.
Okay. Right, we'll end on that note. We'll end on Kelsey's. Was it naivety? Was it stupidity? Let the fans decide. There we go.
This is LS, and you're on Thorin's YouTube channel, so cut the Western shit.